Now that Olivia's not in the car, I can maybe try to go into a little bit more in depth about the satanic murder of my friend David George. And it's so horrible to focus on his murder. He had such an amazing life. He was the only person I knew who had a bin Laden connection, if you can imagine. I mean, that is bizarre. Although I did work at a law firm that Sullivan Cromwell, he was a client of theirs. And when the World Trade came down, Sullivan Cromwell, I did see like in the paper that they gave like everyone who was in the building $100 or something like that as some sort of consolation, because they felt guilty that he was their client or something like that. But yeah, David, David was a wild man, so this is going to be a bit of a wild story, but he was a really great artist, and he did a lot of silkscreen t-shirts that were very complicated. He'd have those kinds of drawings that it starts off with maybe a drawing of the White House, and then it turns into Uncle Sam, which turns into like an eagle, and then something else. So he had these really morphy, almost muralistic, highly detailed t-shirts and things like that. And kind of back in the day, he was sort of from the Vietnam era. He would go to Grateful Dead concerts, and he would wrap his t-shirts that he would make up really, really tight, and he'd put a zillion big rubber bands around them, and he would throw them down onto the stage. By the way, everyone, I am not a Deadhead, and I've never been to a Dead concert. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but anyway, David was, and one day they started picking these up and going, oh my God, these are great t-shirts, and wearing them, and they finally figured out who this guy was, and they ended up taking him to Egypt on their Egypt tour. So he had all these amazing photographs of him, as sort of like this weird kind of part of the band of the Grateful Dead. And, they had this acid dealer, and the whole thing about LSD is so weird to begin with. At Sullivan Cromwell, where I worked, and I think I was talking earlier at some point about the Dulles brothers being part of the law firm at some point along the way. This is like, the 40s, the 50s, kind of during that Cold War era. Remember, Dulles Airport, right? John Foster Dulles on one side, Allen Dulles on the other, J. Edgar Hoover in the middle. And all kinds of crazy things came out of that law firm during that time, including really the creation of the OSS, which eventually became the CIA. It started out as like this war thing, and I still think that the Dulles brothers are the ones who had their hands on the lost Nazi gold. I recently watched a show, like an American History Channel show about it, and it started off where they were sending one of the Dulles brothers over to the war-torn Europe to recover the gold. It hadn't been lost at that point. They said, the gold is here. And then at the beginning of the show, it's got John Foster in some, kind of makeshift tent, and, the secretary woman with the Lily Tomlin operator hair, very kind of just barely post World War II, right at the tail end. And it starts off with him teletyping back to the U.S., back to the Pentagon or whatever. We missed it. The Nazi gold has now been lost. I got here too late. And I always thought when I saw that, yeah, right. I don't think you got here too late. I think it doesn't exist, anymore, because it's with you. And our joke when I worked at Sullivan Cromwell was that the Nazi gold was right there, right? You keep it in the office. Not to go too far off track here, but I think that, the Dulles brothers definitely had their hand in World War II. I think what shocked me, and it's always weird when one realizes that one has been played. No one never wants to fess up to it. And then I later found out that that they really had a lot to do with the whole hippie movement itself, if you can believe it. These, kind of straight-looking, whatever, Wall Street guys. But Sandoz Labs was one of the clients. It was a subsidiary of something, probably of IG Farben, Bayer, all these things. And so the go-between, really, actually, Sandoz Labs sent a huge amount of LSD, which doesn't have to be very much, right? If you have a gallon jar, you can dose all of San Francisco probably or something. They sent a huge amount in liquid form for some reason bizarre to Sullivan Cromwell itself, to the law firm itself. And from there, it went to Jolly West. Jolly West was a very twisted, UCLA psychiatrist, psychologist, way back in the, in California. And they ended up giving it to him. And he ended up really being the one to give it to runaway kids. He opened up a little store, hung out a shingle, a kind of a drop-in center across the street from the bus station where all the runaways and everybody came into San Francisco. So as much as we hear about Owsley being the big kind of acid guy, and I'm sure that he was as well, Jolly West was the one who was really getting everyone. And it's so weird, right? Because everyone who's taking it is thinking they're being all naughty and all counterculture, and yet it's coming from Jolly West, who's getting it from the Dulles brothers at this, extreme kind of Wall Street law firm. Not sure why they were biking up the wrong side of the street in the street, but oh well. So anyway, I think we were getting to the whole weird LSD thing. And so one of the people on this David George Grateful Dead excursion was some kind of acid dealer, if you can imagine. And he came, he flew on the plane with them, and this was kind of one of David's big stories. So I'll share one of David's big stories. When he came back from Egypt, he actually left a little early. The dealer friend said, I've been invited to Saudi Arabia or whatever. Why don't you come with me? And David was no, I'll wait at a hotel for you in New York. I'm really wanting to get back home. I don't know, he was homesick for the U.S., something. So he came back a little bit early, and he then saw his friend. His friend then came back to New York, and he's like, wow, what did you do in Saudi Arabia? And he said, I went to this palace. I was taken to this palace out in the middle of the desert, a palace sort of compound, and I met this man. I was led to meet this man, and he was sitting on a pile of rugs in the middle of a room, and he was just moving his head back and forth. I'm sorry, my throat's a little dry, and it's in midsummer. And he said the guy was going, he was just sort of sing-songing and chanting, like, Osama, Osama, like that was his name, like, da-da-da. And then he said, you don't know me, but I'm going to be a household name. Everyone's going to know who I am. And I work, for the American government, and I'm going to be really famous, and I'm just biding my time right now. I'm just doing acid and biding my time. And so that was totally bizarre, you know, and that was like, I guess, the early 80s, maybe even the late 70s. It may have even been as late as that. So that is a kind of a bizarro thing that was going on. So yeah, so that's David. So David, anyway, was a journalist, an amazing journalist. He had his paper, the Evergreen Free Press, and he just started seeing like weird satanic things going on. I think that maybe one thing that really validated him was the Remembering Satan article in the New Yorker, but he had his own experience, which was weird. You know, he'd had different people who'd had some really terrible experiences, and he had different manuscripts and things that people had written about their experiences that he was always hiding and really concerned about, and he didn't want things stolen, and he was hiding things and making copies. This was he actually died in 2003, not 2004. And so he actually did have his own personal brushes as well on a few occasions. Once he was living on this incredibly beautiful island, and it wasn't the island part, but it was called Steamboat Island, and he lived in this very beautiful, magical house way deep on that island, and it was really hard to find it too. You know, it was always like these weird twists and turns, and if you hadn't been there for a while, it was like always really impossible to even find it. But anyway, that was where he was living, and he was often would just kind of walk around at night. He was just kind of an interesting artist that way. And one night he was out walking, and he just, you know, it was weird. He came into a clearing, and he saw basically a circle, like a full-out satanic circle happening, like just out of a movie or something, in a clearing, like in a meadow, in the middle of the trees, like just, and it was really scary. Like, I remember he kept telling me about it, and he was really scared, and he was like, this doesn't have to do with my research, this doesn't have to do with any of that, this is like what happened, right? This is what happened to him. And the really scary thing was, you know, he didn't know if he'd been seen or not. That was like the scary thing, right? Had he been seen or not by these people? And he was really, really scared about that. And then when he like kind of tried to get out of the clearing, and he ran through this kind of Scotch broom area to escape, he went out, and when he got to this kind of dirt road, there were cars that were parked along it, and all of the cars were like really high up cars. They were like judges' cars, and some of them were even cars that he had like recognized of prominent people. He knew a lot of prominent people because he had his newspaper, and so he was someone who was really involved with kind of everyone on a lot of different levels, because he was always looking for advertisers and articles, and so he was one of those people that just really literally did know everyone. Was this connected to his death or not? I am not so sure. Weirdly, there was a woman he was involved with who he really hadn't wanted to be involved with, and who kind of kept coming over to his house all the time, and she'd had a very tragic life and was involved with just full out, very blatant Satanists who lived in some kind of old gated mansion, like from like the old like warehouse or timber industry people's sort of place. And yeah, I think he went up there like one time and was just completely appalled and freaked out that there was something so elaborate, like this true full out, satanic house. When we're looking into the two people who were caught who murdered him, one of them was the son of a woman in town who had a restaurant, or not a restaurant, like a little fancy kind of shop for kind of like that moms would shop in, called the Tea Lady in downtown Olympia. And he was a Satanist. He was really young. He was like 18. And that was kind of part of the case too. I think it was, should he be tried as an adult or not? Because the murder happened like right around this guy's birthday, I think. And the other person was an exchange student from like Iran or Iraq or Pakistan, somewhere in the Middle East. And what was odd about him was that I met this girl whose mother was the coroner for all of this. And she said it was very strange on two levels. This girl was in high school and had known the exchange student who had been part of the murder of my friend, but her mother was also the coroner. And her mother was given my friend's body parts, which were found in baggies all over town. And then she went one day to go retrieve them, and they were all gone from her locker. And then she went, and the county said they had gotten another coroner, and she was a very experienced coroner, and she said in all of her born days as a coroner, that had never occurred. You never, when you were assigned to someone, you stuck with them. There was no sort of, kind of body hopping. So that was very weird. Another thing that was strange was that the one who was from another country had a brother who was an exchange student as well. And this girl knew the family who was housing them, and at night they would be up on the family's computers all night. And it was like really wigging the family out. And finally the family started to realize it had a lot to do with the port of Olympia. And we're always seeing the logs going out, but I think there's a question of what is coming in. On a few occasions, I've maybe seen some kind of weird fracking material from China, but I don't know. I think that she was kind of trying to say, there's a smuggling operation going on down at the port, and that could be why David was killed too. Maybe he found out about that. So I try to avoid the port. It kind of creeps me out, and I'm not going to put that in the title. I've kind of didn't even mean to talk about that, and it might not be related, but I did talk to the detective when all of this happened, and the detective said, my God, it was like the most vile and violent murder he'd ever seen in his life. And supposedly it was over, and both of the guys, of course, blamed each other, but they were both basically agreeing on one thing, that David owed them $200 for marijuana. And this detective was he was getting ready to retire, and it was almost hard to see him around. He was really he was really into racing cars on salt flats in California. So, he was ready to retire. But I do remember having a conversation with him where he said, no matter how whacked out someone is on methamphetamines or whatever, he'd never seen anything like it, especially over supposedly $200, where David was from a wealthy family. If he didn't have it at that moment, he would definitely have it within a week or so. He had a million friends. Anybody would have given $200. So the detective really wasn't buying it. He wasn't buying that there was something that violent. However, there is another weird thing. They found every part of David except for his head. And then it turned out that there was a woman who appeared named Crystal. And Crystal said, she told the detective, I transported David's head. My job was to put David's head in a box and transport the head north. And she never had to go to court. No one ever forced her to testify or anything. And that has really bothered everyone so greatly that were friends of David George's. And people would go, they would call the police, they would scream, they would say, where is his head? And this woman says, her name is Crystal, she says that she transported his head. And yet she doesn't have to go to court. So we've got so many different threads going on regarding his death that no one is really sure. We really still don't fully know. But anyway, I didn't mean to go so far into all of this stuff, but it's a full moon maybe tonight, or it sure feels like one. And anyway, everyone have a great night. Thanks.